There was once an old lady who lived just outside a village in the eastern mountains. Every day when she got up, her first task of the day was to fetch water from the village well, about a mile's walk there and back again. To carry the water, she had 2 big stone jars that she carried on a piece of wood across her shoulders. They were the same size and shape, and every day she filled them up and every day she walked them home again. The first jar was big and strong, with no blemishes, and every day he carried home a full load of water for the old lady, and he never spilled a single drop. The second jar was the same size and shape as the first, but this one was older and weaker, and she had a maze of tiny cracks around her bottom. And every day as they walked home, from her bottom came the drip, drip, drip. And by the time they got home, she was only half full. Now the second pot used to look at the first pot and think, how does he do it? Every day he brings home all his water. He never spills a drop. He's such a good pot. I'm rubbish. Every day I spill half of mine. I wish I could be a better pot for the old lady. Nobody wants a drippy, cracky bottom. But the little pot was a resourceful pot, and so one day as she sat on the front doorstep, she got to thinking. And as she thought, ding, she had an idea. She jumped off the step and made her way down to a patch of thick, sticky mud by the garden gate. And then she sat in it. A little wriggle, sit yourself in the mud. And as she sat there, she thought about how the next day she would bring all the water home for the old lady, because the mud would fill in her cracks. After she'd sat there and got plenty of mud caked on around her bottom, she pulled herself out with what I think may be the best noise in the world. That noise is this. I think everyone should have a go at making that noise. It is the best noise, and making it brings you joy. So let's all just make that noise together one last time. She pulled herself out of the mud with a brill. Then she sat herself in the sunshine and she waited for the mud to dry around the cracks in her bottom. After it had dried, she went and sat back on the step, and that night she could hardly sleep. She wriggled, she wiggled, she jiggled, and she dreamed about how the next morning she would bring home all the water for the old lady, and she would be so surprised, so happy. She was so excited. The next day the old woman picked up the pots and off she went to the village well. She filled up the first pot, big and strong. She filled up the second pot. She put them on the piece of wood across her shoulders, and she set off walking home. And you know what? The mud worked. The little pot wasn't dripping from the cracks in her bottom. But as they walked, the water still soaked through the cracks in her bottom and into the mud on the outside of the pot. And as the mud on the outside of the pot got wet, it began to fall off with a plop, plop, plop. And after the plop, plop, plop came the drip, drip, drip. And by the time they got home, she was only half full. Still, she would not be beaten. She just thought she needed a better plan. So she sat on the step and she set to thinking. And as she thought, ding, she had an idea. She jumped off the step and she went and she sat under a tree in the middle of the old lady's garden. And as she sat under the tree, the wind blew and gently the leaves blew down from the tree, and some of them fell inside the pot. Brilliant, she thought. These leaves are waxy and waterproof. They'll settle at the bottom of my pot and they will stop the water getting through the cracks. Tomorrow I'll bring home all my water. That night she could hardly sleep with excitement. She wriggled, she wiggled, she jiggled, because the next day she was going to bring home all her water and the old lady would be so surprised. The next morning, off they went to the well. The old lady filled up the first pot. She filled up the second pot. She put them on her shoulders and she started to walk home. And you know what? It was working. The leaves were stopping the water from getting to the cracks. There was no dripping from her bottom. But as they walked, the movement of the old lady's shoulders up and down shook the pot and shook the leaves until slowly they started to float up to the top of the water. And as the leaves floated to the top of the water, from her bottom came the drip, drip, drip. And by the time they got home, she was only half full. Now the little pot was pretty fed up. She tried 2 ideas of her own. Neither of them had worked. She sat on the step and she looked at the first pot and she thought, it's no good. I'll never be as good as him. Then she thought, well, why don't I just ask him? I could just ask him how he does it. So she turned to the first pot and she said, every day you bring home all your water for the old lady. What is your secret? How do you do it? And the first pot looked at her and he said, well, it's really very easy. You see, all I do is I just hold my breath and I hold all the water in, and that is how I do it. It's very easy. The little pot thought, tomorrow I can do that too, and then I'll bring home all my water and the old lady will be so surprised. Now she knew the secret. She was so excited that night she could hardly sleep. She wiggled, she wriggled, she jiggled, and all night long she dreamt about how excited and surprised the old lady would be when she brought home a full load of water. The next day came, the old lady took them to the well. She filled up the first pot. She filled up the second pot. She put them on her shoulders and she set off to walk home. And as she'd filled up the second pot, she had held her breath, just like the first pot told her to. Ready? And she held it in. And you know what? It was working. Holding her breath was holding in the water as they walked home, and it was really going so well. There were no drips from her bottom. I mean, it was getting a little bit uncomfortable and a little bit hard to keep holding her breath, but it was really working until eventually she couldn't do it anymore. And as soon as she let go of her breath, from her bottom came the drip, drip, drip. And by the time they got home, she was only half full. Now, the little pot was gutted. She had tried everything she could think of. She'd tried 2 of her own ideas. She'd asked for advice and nothing had worked. She sat on the step and she thought, I'm just going to have to accept it. I will never be as good a pot as him. I will always let the old lady down. And she sat on the step and she started to cry. As she cried, the old lady heard her and came out and sat down next to her. And then she said, I've been watching you, little pot. I know what you've been doing. Come with me. I've got something to show you. And she picked up the little pot and set off back to the village well. As they walked, the old lady said, just look down there at the side of the road. I think you might see something that makes you feel a little bit better. And the pot looked down. And there at the side of the road were the most beautiful flowers she'd ever seen, in all the colours of the rainbow and more. And you know, they did make her feel a little bit better. They lifted her spirits. The old lady stopped and she began to speak to the pot. You've been trying to make yourself a better pot. You looked at the other pot, the first pot, and you thought, because he brings home all his water every day and never spills a drop, you thought he was better than you. That's not how it works. I know how you are made, and I have different tasks for each of you. Every day, his job is to bring home a full pot of water and not spill a drop, and every day he does it. But that's not your job. I know that every day as we walk along this path, you will share your water as we go. And so I planted these seeds at the side of the path, and every day you water them as we walk home. That is why the flowers have grown. Your job is to bring home half a pot of water and share the other part with these flowers. Because of you, this bit of the world is more beautiful. Because of you, every traveller who walks this way has their spirits lifted by the colours of these plants. That is your job, and you are perfect for it. Then the old lady took the little pot home and she put her on the step. And finally, the little pot understood. She didn't have to be like anyone else. She just needed to be herself. She settled down on the step, and you know what? She never tried to fix the cracks in her bottom again.